who have received gainful employment, many of them with criminal records, many of them who don't have GEDs or high school diplomas. Kudos. But that's not the silver bullet. The silver bullet begins to look at the divestment that has occurred in these neighborhoods historically, and to really map a reasonable path to reconcile those deficits. So, and the old Kennedy Middle School, which was one of the worst schools in the city, it closed. Many neighbors, many of my neighbors, left the community for a lack of meaningful outcomes in the classroom. Rich or poor, families want to educate their kids. I'll close with this part. We now have the Hollis Innovation Academy, but it's bigger than just a school, pre-K through 8th grade STEM program. It's bigger than just labeling a STEM program. We have an unprecedented partnership with Georgia Tech and their seismic program that's doing great things to ensure that it's not just STEM in words, but it's STEM in reality and helping to perfect science, technology, engineering, and math. But we also have community-based partners that are engaged, like Raising Expectations and other folks. I count, Dr. Royster, is it over $1 million that Tech has probably spent in the Washington cluster in the past couple of years? I'm not even going to talk about the probably about $1 million now that Blank has spent, Arthur Blank Foundation, in the Washington cluster. Because we realize that if we're going to keep families in the neighborhood and really make it a community, we've got to educate those babies. We've got to educate those children and empower those heads of households that we failed in classrooms previously to do better than they're doing now. There's other stuff to talk about, and we'll get to it. But it's a different season today than it is in '89 when they started building the original dome, because it's not just about sticks and bricks.
Right, so are you saying that it's more of a holistic approach this time around? Is that right? Am I getting that? Mr. Fernandez, do you want to, I know you just listed a whole bunch of different programs. I mean, can you talk about a little bit more about why those would have an impact this time when, what happened with the Georgia Dome didn't?
Sure, and I think to Councilman Young's point, it really is trying to have this comprehensive approach. So when you think about, on the people side, you have to think about education, you got to think about health, economic inclusion, crime and safety, civic empowerment. All of these things together help create and help build upon the community you have. And for us, in terms of investing in Hollis, and really it's an anchor for the turnaround of the Washington cluster. And we've seen gains there the first time in years. You have a great leadership there, Dr. Jack, some of the other nonprofit partners who are doing the wraparound services. Those are all pieces of the puzzle that come together to make the change we need to see. But what I would emphasize is that we have a lot of good start. I'm happy to talk a little bit about some of the different collaboratives if that's helpful. But the stadium, we're here partially today because the stadium's opening. But that's just one milestone. This is not something that gets solved in a 3-year period. This is a long-term project for us, and I think for all the folks who are here and a lot of the folks who are in the audience, this is not 3 years or 5 years. This is a 10 to 20-year proposition and project and commitment from us and others to really get the kind of change that folks want to see, to really get at what Makeda talks about a lot, is this beloved community that we want to try to help create, because a lot of place-based efforts either don't go well and nothing changes like the first time around, or you just have gentrification. Folks get kicked out. How can we create, to your point, a different model that is more inclusive, that tries to strike that balance? Because one of the challenges that folks have when you talk to residents is that we have a concentration of poverty. So we have to deconcentrate that. How do we honor the folks who are here and make sure they can stay and benefit from the changes that are happening, while at the same time be welcoming to newcomers and welcoming and embracing how Atlanta is changing and evolving? And that's not easy. That is hard work, and that requires everyone being at the table together and working it out, and working it out over a period of time. But I think those are the kinds of things we have to focus on over the long term to really be able to move the needle in the way folks want to see.
So, Councilmember, you mentioned community benefit agreements, and I think, Fernando, you mentioned commitment to the community. When and how does the community actually express themselves, and where are these commitments? Because in every document I've seen, it's a contract, right? So to build the dome and to build the Mercedes-Benz with the developers, you have to have a contract. With everyone who's building, there's a contract. But there is no contract with the community. There is no oversight committee. So if all of a sudden the Blank Foundation decided we're going to pack up and do something else across town, what does that leave the community? So we've been asking for a commitment in the terms of a contract, which is called a community benefit agreement. I don't think the problem was finding someone to sign the agreement. And you talk about capacity building, you have Invest Atlanta and you have a number of other agencies that could help to add capacity to these nonprofit organizations and other small developers. But what they're asking for with Turner Field, as well as with this stadium, is still a contract with them, because we know we're in the middle of the city election. The city gets to change the direction of the next 8 years to 20 years, just on their vote this year. The priority has been to remake the city so that visitors will come and stay, come to the games, go to the Georgia Dome, go to the Mercedes-Benz, go to all the things that they're building downtown. What I'm asking for is, what do the residents get? Where's the resident retention program? The historic resident retention program? Where is the contract for the community to say, we value you, not just because a sports team wants a Super Bowl, we value you, so we're going to invest in you for generations.
Well, and I think she's getting to a distinction that maybe not everyone might be familiar with between a community benefits plan and a community benefits agreement, right? The difference is that the agreement would be binding.
Yeah. And there's a binding and oversight, right? So there's an agreement of this is what we're going to do. And they've done some great things. I'm sure all in the West Side, people have seen the effect of the Blank Foundation being there. That's not in question right now. What we're questioning is, what's the long-term effect, and how do we make sure that those things that are promised now are promises kept, so that we're not sitting here 10 years from now, 15 years from now saying, oh yeah, I remember when they did that, and everyone's gone.
Well, Mr. Fernandez, I mean, the Blank Foundation has invested millions at this point. Why couldn't there have been a binding agreement?
So that was before I got here. So I can't speak to that part of it. What I can speak to is our commitment in terms of where we're at. And so the original Neighborhood Prosperity Fund that was set up as part of the whole stadium negotiation process was $15 million. And by the end of this year, we will have committed at least $22 million to these communities in terms of workforce, health, education, parks, community retention. And so we are meeting that commitment, and Arthur has said internally as well as publicly now multiple times that that commitment does not end when the stadium opens, that commitment does not end when the Super Bowl comes. That is a long-term, his words were, this is a forever commitment. So we will continue to invest in these communities over the long term and partner with residents in all the work we try to do. Because I think to your question around how we try to engage residents, there are several residents here, and there's multiple different ways we try to do that in terms of, we have issue-specific collaborators around health, education, economic inclusion, community retention. We have residents that are part of that. We have public meetings where we try to share that and get feedback throughout the whole process. And that's not something that you just do in the beginning. It's something that has to be embedded in this going forward. So from our perspective, we're here, we're a partner. Do we always get it right? No. But we are committed to figuring it out together with community and others to try to move the needle.
In partial response to what I've heard, there are agreements that are taking place right now, and those agreements focus on the implementation of the community benefits plan. When you talk about what we're doing with workforce development, it was built on land that's owned by a gentleman who grew up in the Vine City community, but came back and started his own community development corporation, Leonard Adams, with Quest Communities. And it ties to his partnership with a gentleman who was raised in Dixie Hills, Reverend Howard Beckham, who for several years before the stadium was even discussed, started a workforce development agency, a nonprofit out of his church, and had great metrics of success. And so there are new visionary community developers that are engaged in agreements today that are a direct consequence of their success and their capacity to succeed. We're not just cutting checks on great vision. Great vision has to be partnered with implementing agents that have the capacity to start and finish what they say they can start and finish. And so I would venture to say this is a very short period of time. I think wrong for us to expect that in a few years you're going to completely transform what took years to break, decades to break, decades of neglect, I would mention. And so we say all this as if a community benefits agreement would have been required 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. I correct you, no way. This community didn't need to be corrected. These communities had everything they needed. The question that I would ask is how does a society extract the valuable assets that help to sustain a community, and then expect the community to thrive or to continue to grow? And so we're repairing, we're replacing, we're fixing with a new set of partners who are fully committed. And so are the agreements done? No, there are more agreements to be had.
Community benefit agreement?
I would agree I would agree with you that the one failing in all of this is there absolutely needs to be more community-based, homegrown entrepreneurship and business development opportunities that come out of this investment. If we go through this season and we don't have anything to show for it but these investments by a few philanthropists, and when the philanthropic dollars are gone, what happens? Well, the conversation with Reverend Beckham now is, how does Westside Works sustain itself beyond the season of a stadium? And there are actually engaged conversations that we're having with private sector and even public sector opportunities to keep people employed. The Chick-fil-A that's coming to the West Side, you don't, it's not a silver bullet to have a restaurant, but it is important that if you bring a restaurant to the West Side, that it should be a black-owned Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
Come on, let's talk about, and so we took Mr. Quincy Springs, who lives in 30318, the West Side community, who's the general manager of the Walmart, who stood up and stepped up, and with the cooperation of Dan Cathy, will be the future owner of the Chick-fil-A right there on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. There are a number of efforts that we should build with existing residents, with existing entrepreneurs, with existing developers out of the community that are a part of this plan. But again, that's a very methodical process. A mistake to think that we're going to solve all this in 3 years or finish everything in 3 years. As stated, we have decades of work to do.
Ms. Scott, I'll let you respond, and then I want to go on to a different question.
So that brings up a good point, because I think you've been in office for 15 years.
Yes.
A number of the city council members have been there for at least 15 years or more. We've had 30 years, at least, of black elected officials in charge of the city of Atlanta. What responsibility does the elected officials of this city have towards these communities? So, it's great with what Mr. Blank has done, and given his age and his health, I'm sure he's going to be up there, right? So my question is, so beyond their commitment, what is the city's commitment? What is your commitment as an elected official in this area that has watched this poverty over the years? What is your commitment to these communities and the communities? Now we have Turner Field happening. What is your commitment to those communities as well? What is your commitment to community benefit agreements? Because that's really what we're talking about. How do the communities benefit from these developments for years to come? When it's all said and done, the elected officials have to be the ones to help hold people accountable. So I'm asking what the commitment is of the elected officials that will be here beyond the stadium opening.
There's been consistent growth and redevelopment in the community that I live in, that is the West Side, that is not the 6 o'clock soundbite that you see every 6 o'clock. There are great neighbors that have resided in these communities for decades that don't represent the blight that gets mischaracterized all the time. There absolutely is work to be done. It's false to think that an elected official is going to solve all these problems, fix education, I'm sorry, answer the question? Those in elected office absolutely have a charge and a responsibility to fight for their community, the people they represent. But understand, there's no one fixed demographic that they represent. You're up against people within your very community who would charge you for not supporting them when all it's been is their effort to pimp the community and extract resources that are brought to a community. So not only are you contending with trying to advocate to get government to come in alignment, you're working with community-based groups who they themselves, without capacity, are using their political power to extract resources at the expense of the people that you advocate and represent. So what you say would suggest that we didn't spend $2.5 million before Arthur Blank got here to create free health care for the residents of the Vine City community. What you would say is that even the Georgia Dome Housing Trust Fund, which many residents in this very community benefited from $30,000, $40,000 down payment assistance to buy houses in this community, and they've consistently done that. You would suggest that we've not funded and helped to support Odyssey Villas, intact homeless families within the Vine City community, or the almost 100 families, individuals that are supported on the Quest campus who represent not only homeless, not only substance abuse addicted, but veterans. There are a number of things, in addition to the single family homes that have been built and are still occupied. Are these all silver bullets? Most of these things you didn't hear me talk about what were the major reforms that happened with education to reverse the decades of things that weren't done. It's real convenient to want to point the finger at an elected official who weekly fights to advocate to get the body politic. Think it's easy to converse with a mayor who's very opinionated and a city council who's very opinionated and to create the kind of resurgence that we're having right now. This didn't happen because somebody from outside the community wanted to happen. What would an Arthur Blank have done if you'd simply obeyed the whims and will of poverty pimps who would attempt to extort money from billionaires, who would allow that to happen, rather than do responsible programming to develop a plan and to come up with a strategy to implement? We had to build confidence with these outside partners to even be at the table right now. And that has been the case with every partnership that we've ever had. They had to have an understanding that there was a will within the core of the neighborhood to act honorably and to do what was in the best interest. But there's so much more to do. I mean, and so I accept the full weight of whatever you want to thrust on this elected official, but it won't be for lack of fighting and going toe-to-toe with our friends in the mayor's office under Shirley Franklin, our friends in the mayor's office under Cassine Reed. But again, the challenges that you face from within the neighborhood, from folks who just simply weren't acting honorably. Sorry, thank you for your patience.
I do want to hear Professor Flower's thoughts, actually, because I mean, we've been talking a lot about problems, but the Blank Foundation, I hear, is investing basically an unprecedented amount for the league. And also recently we saw that the Atlanta City Council passed a housing trust fund for the neighborhoods around Georgia State Stadium, which was Turner Field. And I think they put $5 million into that, right? So are we seeing any sort of shift in, I guess, you know, in bringing these communities, bringing them more further into the discussion?
It's an interesting question. So the reality is that while stadiums are exceptional by virtue of their size and cost, they are utterly unexceptional in that they are shaped by the same forces that shape all other aspects of life in the city, whether it's class, race, or politics. And part of the challenge in the U.S. context is there are so many more bad models than there are good models. And one of the issues that I think is interesting in the context of
big or small, it's an asset today that we should take advantage of.
So
I can respond to the earlier points. I do think we're just starting and trying to think through how we grow that. So I can give you a quick background on how we're trying to use the stadium specifically as an asset for the community. So during construction, I think we're going to get the final numbers in the next 60 days, but almost 38 to 39% of all the work and the procurement that happened at Mercedes-Benz Stadium went to minority and women-owned businesses. 38 to 39%. And over 460 Westside residents helped build that stadium, worked for the firms that helped build that. And that was one of the first public commitments that Arthur made during the whole negotiation process, is that we're going to hire Westside residents to help build the stadium. And so from our perspective, that's a good starting point in terms of how do we leverage the stadium during construction. And now that we're going to be opening up, or we have effectively opened up, is how we start to hire folks. So, for example, we've already hired over 150 residents to help operate the stadium. Work directly for the stadium, for the food and beverage company, as well as the security company. They're going to have staff and operate the stadium. We have a Westside Ambassadors program where we have already 22 Westside youth who will be working in the stadium in different internship opportunities, hoping to grow that to 50 to 60 youth. We're going to have that unique opportunity, work in Arthur's Suite, work throughout the building. Third, the largest concession area in the 300 level is called West Nest. It is staffed and operated by Westside Works graduates. So that's the Workforce Development Center that folks are referring to, which has been a program with the Foundation in partnership with Integrity Community-Based Group. And that, a portion of the proceeds of that concession area will go to pay for the culinary training. And lastly, I think getting to your point about this stadium, especially football stadiums being these kind of dead buildings or dead assets most of the year, Arthur's vision really is a larger vision for where the dome sits now. When it comes down, there's going to be a 13-acre park, the Home Depot backyard. And the vision is to have 100 to 200 community activation events a year, where we can have youth sports, so youth football and soccer. We can have farmers markets. We can have field days. We can have steam tours of the stadium for Westside youth. So really thinking through over time, how do we leverage this stadium as a connection point to economic opportunity and a real community asset instead of just a private asset.
Professor Flowers alluded to this a moment ago. I mean, he's told me before that the average lifespan for a stadium right now is about 20 years. So is that really long enough to enact long-term change?
So our estimate of the lifespan of this stadium hopefully is longer than that. For us, it's a 35 to 40-year commitment.
Of the resident retention program. That's a micro win. And we can applaud that because nobody else has that. And that's community advocacy and us staying at the table. And right now, Vine City, English Avenue, and maybe Castleberry are the only communities that have that. So I want to just say to our council member, to the Blank Foundation, it was a long battle, but we're getting it.
Their own to stay. There would have been no argument or fight. Analysis done on past schools, we should save it. But it really takes some innovative, creative thought. I have brought developers to Clark Atlanta University in hopes of brokering some sort of relationship. That's not happened yet, but we haven't given up. The other historic assets on the corridor absolutely need to be preserved, and that effort is ongoing. It doesn't stop. But you can't do it just on well-wishing and good thoughts and great vision. You have to have partners, and for the first time, we've got partners. E.R. Carter Elementary School, which would have been another vacant and abandoned building, is now the headquarters for the Families First, that's providing great resources for families on the west side, occupying an existing building. There are other things, other programs, other dollars being invested that are changing the lives of people. You know, we reduced the classroom sizes at Hollis Innovation Academy through the West Side Future Fund, where I sit on this board. You know, billionaires just don't give because you put a gun to their head. You have to make a convincing argument. And so when we now have, instead of one child for every 26 kids at Hollis Innovation Academy, we have one child for every 13 children, which provides a more personalized attention to our kids at Hollis. we could talk all day about what Dr. Royster and the West Side Community Alliance is doing on the West Side. We've got a lot of engaged partners. And we have, and we will have more agreements made with viable service providers and folks who have capacity to deliver. But the days of us cutting checks and making agreements on vision alone are over. They're over. We have to engage in meaningful relationships where we can have measured outcomes, because we don't take these investments lightly. And what you're saying about preservation is critical.
So we're running out of time, unfortunately, and I really liked his first point about how stadiums in general can cut off a community, and we've seen that with the Georgia Dome, the Georgia World Congress Center, and now we have Mercedes-Benz, which is a huge development. Can you talk about that? Like, how do you reconnect communities? I mean, you've already built this structure, so how do you mitigate the problems that come with that at this point?
So it's actually something we've talked a lot about internally and started talking about externally, is how do you use the stadium to reconnect the West Side to downtown Atlanta, to the rest of Atlanta? And so some of it is how we try to activate the stadium so people feel it's welcoming to them. But also some of it's the connectivity you need in terms of partnering with the Path Foundation, as we've done. They're building a trail right now from the West Side Beltline all the way to the front door of the stadium, and we'll help them support to get them from there connected to the campus all the way to Centennial Olympic Park to address some of that, but also having a spur to Cook Park to make sure we're starting to better connect all these different neighborhoods, because you do have, this North Side Drive is this big barrier. And so even there, how can we work with the Georgia Department of Transportation around making that freeway not feel and seem like a freeway in terms of sidewalk improvements, median improvements, walkways? All that together starts to make a difference, because it's a real issue, it's a real challenge.
Professor Flores, from a design perspective, could you talk about that really quickly?
Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do, but after the fact, they're much, much harder. And so one of the things I always try to emphasize is that the event horizon of a stadium is easily 3 or 4 times the actual footprint of the building itself. And the U.S., again, is paradoxical among developed nations in continually, by and large, siting stadiums in poor neighborhoods. You go to other countries and you often can find a stadium smack dab in the middle of one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. So if you go to Dublin, you go to the Aviva Stadium, it's in the Ballsbridge neighborhood, surrounded by multi-million-dollar homes. And that can happen because at the outset it was clear that the design of the stadium could not loom over the city, could not disrupt existing patterns of traffic, had to actually accentuate and reinforce public transportation by doing things like eliminating almost all surface parking. There's like 40 parking spots at this stadium underground, and they're primarily for handicapped individuals. In the American context, it is much more challenging because the interests of the city, as it relates to the stadium, are often in direct contrast with the interests of the team and the league. Because in the NFL, revenue is shared, except for stadium revenue. So as an owner-operator, you have a very different set of incentives. You want to maximize the ease with which people can access your venue by their mode of location and choice. So after the fact, one of the things that I would suggest would be that you would lay out what would be called a stadium neighborhood. You actually say, that's not going to be the name of it, but you say this is the footprint, and here are the things that now that we've invested $1.5 billion, we make a commitment over the next 10 to 15 years to investing another $1 billion to solve, again, those problems. Because the problems in the neighborhoods are not the product of the stadium alone, and they cannot be solved by the stadium alone. But you can leverage the stadium as a driver, as a way to organize community, but also as a way to leverage investment and say, look, if we really want to make this a game changer, if the Falcons want to be a team unlike any other in the world, or at least in the NFL, which I think is an aspiration, then here's a way to do that. And you bring in designers and you think about pedestrian access and bridges and public transport and streetscape improvements and all of this in a way that, generally speaking, never happens because the stadium is imagined as a building that begins and ends at the outer walls. So I think that's a change in thinking.
Good evening. I kind of disagree with you, Professor, but...
Do you want to introduce yourself?
First of all, my name is J.R. Murphy. Everybody on this podium, besides you, Professor, know who I am. And I'm connected to you through Georgia Tech and Jennifer Levy with the Urban Honeybee Program.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm one of her first students, and I'm a beekeeper in Vine City. But I want to know this question, and we've certainly been around everything else. What is the possibility of the urban farmers and beekeepers that's in Vine City and all of the surrounding area being able to sell our produce straight to the Georgia
Mercedes-Benz Stadium?
It's in lieu and in connection with Truly Living Well.
Which is another urban farm.
Right.
Can you answer that, Mr. Fernandez?
Yeah, I can answer it in
Thanks
two
so
parts.
much,
So,
Dan.
one of the things that we have a vision for in terms of the Home Depot backyard is farmers markets, where we can bring in someone like JR, some of the folks at Truly Living Well, which are nonprofits we've supported, to be able to create that opportunity for having residents be able to access that, but also the opportunity for the entrepreneurs to be able to sell their wares. So that's definitely something we can do there. In terms of, one of the things I'm focused on right now is what are some of the procurement opportunities at the stadium now that it's operating, and really looking at that. How do we make it available in terms of some of the local businesses that are here? And so that process is now starting as well.
Can I make an objection? Because I'm affiliated also with Atlanta Food Bank and most of the urban farmers, besides Truly Living, in this area. And we would like to be able to have a talk maybe with you, with all of you, okay? And sit down, because we have actually did a study on, and we're working on a lot of these communities right around. Asheview is one for now, okay? We've already did a study on Vine City and English Avenue. So we are kind of prepared to come at you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think we're basically just about out of time, but I did want to ask this question to most of you, if we could squeeze this in, because basically so far we've been talking a lot about community revitalization and development in the context of a stadium. And why does the conversation have to start with the stadium? Why does the city look to these sort of big development projects to revitalize the neighborhood around it? Do you understand what I'm asking? Like, why don't we just spend that $200 million on the neighborhoods themselves? I think we've gotten that question a lot leading up to this event, so could we all answer that?
Well, yeah, and I think Councilman Young talked about this, and you shouldn't have to have a stadium to invest in revitalizing, helping to transform a community that has this historic significance to the city and to this country. I completely agree with that. I think from our perspective, where we're at now is, I can't change that besides saying we need to, not wait to stadiums across the city, because, the West Side isn't the only area that has need that is, really kind of segregated from opportunity in a lot of ways. How do we make that something that all of Atlanta has? Because all these studies have been coming out lately around how Atlanta has some of the lowest economic mobility in the country. That needs to change. And you can't, to your point, you can't have a stadium in all these different neighborhoods. We need to collectively build the political will to change that.
One thing that unites politicians across all parties, across all geographies in the United States, is the edifice complex. And it is redoubled when it comes to sports stadiums. I have no idea why this is so. And if someone could figure it out, it would be an act of psychoanalytical genius.
Because men are making the decision.
Well, it happens in city councils that also have a fair representation. I mean, it is universal in the United States. Why that is so, I don't know, but it is.
So I would offer a couple of things. One, first a plug, we're having a number of candidate forums for mayor, city council, council president, and school board. And they're designed from the residents' perspective. I think we've lost our way in terms of putting historic residents at the forefront of these elections, as well as the forefront of these development decisions. When we talk about only 20% actually is coming from these other sources. The 80% of the taxpayers that live in these communities that continue to pay the highest water rates, the highest taxes around transportation, the highest sales taxes, it's a regressive tax and they're paying for it. So although they may not be paying directly for the stadium, all the infrastructure that goes around those stadiums are paid by the residents of the city, and they get the shift every single time. The fact that there aren't any quality grocery stores outside of the Walmart in the area is a problem, right? The fact that there aren't buses connected to these communities, it's a problem. The fact that the jobs that we're talking about, and it's great that we trained a number of people to work at the stadium, but as Ms. Johnson said, what about the people in the upper echelons, the decision makers? Why are we not tracking how many people from the Atlanta University Center actually receive benefits from the stadium? What is the benefit of this stadium looming over the Atlanta University Center and Morris Brown or parts of Clark looking like it does without that external investment? Why have we cut off the investment only to those neighborhoods that are seen on the other side of the stadium? So I think it's the will, it's the human spirit that has to rise again, that we have to, not look at Falcons and Braves and Hawks to save us, that we need to look back at the core of what makes Atlanta great, and that's our people. So we have to put our people first and continue to put our people first, and they have an opportunity to decide what kind of city they will have on November 7th when you vote for your city council and your new mayor.
So the question was, why do we need these stadiums to bring this kind of revitalization to neighborhoods?
We don't, but we do.
We should.
We shouldn't.
The history of the West Side, we didn't. But when you talk about what's happened since the 1960s and the kinds of transitions that we've gone through as a community, where we had a multitude of demographics from rich and poor that lived in the same community that sustained their own grocer, their own pharmacies, their own businesses on the West Side. And so, as we transition beyond that, here we are today. No, it shouldn't have taken a stadium to have this conversation. No, when they built I-75 and severed the West Side from downtown, when they built the World Congress Center in the 80s, when they originally built the original dome, it further severed us from the West Side. But at the end of the day, all of the dollars that we publicly procured, model cities, empowerment zones, what does the evidence reveal? The evidence reveal is local control, controlled by specific stakeholders, and not collaborative groups to perfect how these dollars get spent. And so these dollars didn't lead to transformative change. So, so here we are. It's false to think that a stadium can transform the mind, body, and spirit of a community. And so as we educate generations of young people, 8 years before I took office, I owned an early learning program as an architect. And the early learning proved that, if you give children a love for education, they'll do the rest. Why is it that as a city, we tolerated 50% dropout rates in this city, poor outcomes in our classrooms, and think that these very neighborhoods that raise great folks who now are failing people in the classrooms, that you're going to produce transformative change with the stadium? It's false. So it is not going to happen overnight, but the foundational changes that are happening for better outcomes in the classroom, foundational changes by taking heads of households. These are people who we may have failed previously, but we now can train them and get them better prepared to pursue a career path to take care of their own business. And yes, every time we have an opportunity, you engage a local, community-based business. Look at Sister Precious Muhammad at the corner of Joseph Lowry and Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, and ask her where she got the dollars to preserve those historic Bronner Brother properties at that corner. And now as she operates as a mom and pop in the neighborhood, providing event venues and restaurant and other activities in buildings that she owns, you know, we have to seek every opportunity to do that from within the community. And I think it's happening. It's slow but methodical. If we're consistent on our end and do better, many of the things that Ms. Scott mentions are things that we should absolutely champion. We've got to promote that the community benefits agreement, that it has to happen. But it can't just happen within a person or an entity. It has to be a collaborative, and it has to engage all of the community stakeholders that are impacted in making the decisions on the agreement. And the day that that happens, Turnerfield neighborhoods will have their agreement. West Side neighborhoods will have their agreement. We're seeking to build such a collaborative group from Hamilton Holmes Drive all the way to North Side Drive, so that we don't have to operate in a vacuum. We can speak with a voice that is the people's voice. But when the people's voice are the poverty pimps and the politicians have to fight the pimps within the neighborhood just to get sustained resources moving through to address real change, it ain't easy, folks.
We'll have to end it there. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here, and thanks so much to the Woodruff Library for hosting us. I'm sorry we didn't get to your question, but maybe we can answer it offline. I'm happy to hang out, but I think we have to be out of this building by 8:30, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.